policies like trade, education, tourism. Again, as I was saying, migration and the way we are approaching this is a whole of government and whole of society approach. This means that it does not just fall to Home Affairs or the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Labor or Foreign Affairs. We have to tackle this as a whole of government, but also whole of society, civil society, multilaterals, moving this forward. And we ultimately need to rebrand the concept focusing on the developmental angle to counter negative biases. Yes, we know there are many, many challenges with migration. What we see are these challenges playing out on the news cycle. But there are a lot of wonderful benefits as well. And we can deal with some of that negativity, some of what's happening in North Africa, if we look at it in a concerted, holistic approach, working together. One of the areas that the African Union is putting across, the AUC, is the Joint Program on Labor Migration Governance for Development and Integration, the JLMP. So the AUC does have a program now in which there was initial funding coming in from the Swedish government to put forward some of these gains and some of these ideas that we would like to have for the African continent. The overall objective is strengthen the effective governance and regulation of labor migration and mobility in Africa under the rule of law with the involvement of key stakeholders, all relevant government ministries and departments, private employers, workers' organizations, migrants, the diaspora, and multilaterals. The first objective is to strengthen effective governance of labor migration arrangements in Africa. Another one would be to support implementation of labor migration standards and policies. And the collection of gender and age disaggregated data on migrant economic activity, employment, skills, education, working conditions, and social protection. Data is tantamount, and it is something that I will honestly admit is severely lacking. The data on migration, not just in Africa, across the globe, is something in which we are truly aiming to improve. We need a wider implementation of labor migration regimes, a resolution of skilled shortages, and increased recognition of harmonized qualifications across Africa. We need to strengthen the capacity of labor institutions at the AUC and at the regional economic community level, and at select national governments on labor migration. We need to increase ratification and domestication of key international standards and achieve wider elaboration, adoption, and implementation of the harmonized free circulation regimes and coherent national labor migration policies. This is happening. This is what the AUC has put across, and we are beginning within a multilateral system. The ILO, the IOM, the AUC, along with other actors, are now beginning to implement this labor migration program for Africa. So it is important for members of the Pan-African Parliament to be aware that this is on its way. Mr. President, let me finish off with just presenting a little bit on what's coming up in December in Marrakesh in Morocco, which is the signing of the United Nations Global Compact on Migration. This all arose in 2016 through a UN high-level meeting on refugees and migrants in New York, in which the New York Declaration was put in place. For the commitment to launch a process to develop the Compact on Refugees, in which UNHCR is leading, and a commitment to launch a process to develop a global compact for migration. It was a suggestion to develop this non-binding, and that's something important to note, a non-binding principles and guidelines on migrants in vulnerable situations. It was also the forum in which the IOM, my agency, was formally welcomed and brought in to the UN system as a related agency to the UN. Previously, We were born in 1951. We've been around almost 70 years, and we've kind of had one leg into the UN and one leg out. No longer. We are fully there and fully invested into the UN system, and happily so. The Global Compact is framed within the 2030 SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, to produce principles, commitments, and understanding on international migration, to contribute to the global governance, enhance coordination, be a framework for comprehensive international cooperation, and include all aspects of international migration within it, and of course be a member state-led process. Again, the Global Compact on Migration is not being led by the IOM or the United Nations. It is being designed and led by member states of the United Nations. It is a clear, transparent, and inclusive process. We included member states from all regions, the UN, regional and sub-regional bodies. We had broader migration communities such as civil society, migrants and diaspora organizations, academia, private sector and unions, international financial institutions, and of course, did this through regional consultative processes on migration and international regional fora. As I was saying, there was a three-phase process. We are now finished all of those processes. The compact has been written, and we are now awaiting for this adoption in Marrakesh, Morocco, from the 10th to 12th of December, in which the compact will be signed. There's 23 broad objectives in the compact, and what I can say, I won't list them all, but what I can say is that 2/3 of these objectives speak directly to development at the national level, and certainly labor migration and the governance of migration are principles within these objectives, within 2/3 of these. Other areas include the emergency response, displacement, and these types of things. But truly the compact is looking at working with member states towards using migration as a developmental instrument. IOM's vision, if I can provide, is truly a world in which migrants move by choice. I won't even say migrants, people. All of us move around, and not out of desperate necessity, which is what we're finding today. And the rights of migrants are protected throughout this process, and that it should be well governed and be a positive force for all. The three major objectives are facilitating safe, orderly, and regular migration. That is the migration we wish to have. Reducing incidents and impact of forced and irregular migration. This is the migration we do not wish to have. And responding to the mobility impacts of natural and human-made disasters. The migration that occurs whether we want it or not. But it's through joint efforts. We need to draw on existing norms, the protection of rights, and the governance of migration. We need it to be actionable and practical, the compact, to ensure the safety, dignity, and human rights of all migrants, to govern migration effectively and humanely, and realize the developmental potential of migrants for the home and host societies. But let me put it across that this success, and I think you're going to see this as a trend in my talk today, success depends on working together. That's my takeaway to you. And ultimately to the Pan-African Parliament, my main point is we need champions. And I see champions in you. That's my message to you. Can you please, at national level, begin to be champions for some of this great work? And the question that I leave you today is, how can we leverage the position of the Pan-African Parliament, members of Parliament, towards bridging the gap that I talked about between continental and regional commitments and your national realities? I'll leave you with saying that when properly managed, labor migration truly has far-reaching potential for countries of origin and destination, the migrants, their communities, and of course, the employers in which drive many of our economies. Migration truly can be for the benefit of all. Mr. President, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jason. Dear colleagues, I think that when we're speaking of migration, for us, this needs to be a collective awareness building, because today we're speaking more and more of migration from Africa to Europe and from one African state to another. For those who know the background, you will remember that de Moronoba addressed this topic, and they were going to work in the cocoa plantations, and this was in Côte d'Ivoire. And you know that in the large empires of Mali, etc., these were empires that encompassed a number of countries that exist today, and people were free in this space to move from place to place to work. But the issue of migration has been there ever since the colonial era. We had European migrants who came to Africa to conquer it. So that's also a type of migration. At that time, there were no visas. No one requested anything. They came, found land, and established themselves. And ever since the 1881, with the Berlin Agreement and with the birth of the nation states, the problem then resumed. And now we talk about it. And when it comes to moving from one country to another, we then had to apply visas. And the issue here is to know the states are making their migration requirements stricter because of terrorism, etc. And the issue here is whether, in reality, are the terrorists actually going beyond this issue of visas. And migration, as presented here, you'll find that there are two types of migration. We have internal migration and external migration. And it's our youth whom we are losing in the Mediterranean Sea and have become slaves, for instance, in Libya. And we have strongly condemned this. And trafficking is taking place with people crossing the desert. And the aim of all this movement is to find well-being. And this is why we have the issue of good governance in our states. And you find that youth will move from their countries of origin. And dear colleagues, if you manage to visit Greece, Italy, or Spain, you will see how our African youth are actually living there. And those who have had the opportunity to reach there are established there, but a lot have drowned in the Mediterranean, and we don't talk about them. And for instance, if you go to the Italian migrant camps and you ask them what conditions they are living, and if you ask them whether they would like to stay in that country or go back to their own country, you'll find that a lot would want to go back and others are prepared to stay. So the fundamental issue is governance in our states, and to resolve the issue of the youth, because our African youth represents 60%, and we need to find jobs for them. And the migration of our youth will not stop unless we address that. And the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, had declared the issue of chosen migration. But within this chosen migration, you only see the creme de la creme. And you'll find that it's doctors, intellectuals who are of interest to the West. But in this, we are losing our our best in profit of those in the West who are willing to take them. So we are called upon to ensure that the regional agreements and continental agreements on the free movement of people and goods becomes a reality. And we have 1 billion of the population, and if the free movement of people and goods is a reality, and if intra-African trade is a reality, you can create employment and thus diminish the phenomenon of migration. So this is what I wanted to highlight. There were various questions that were raised, but I would now like to give the floor to the Deputy Chairperson of the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters to give his presentation. Honorable Alex Chersia Grant, you have the floor.
Good morning, colleague, Mr. President, members of the Bureau, distinguished parliamentarians, visitors, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, not forgetting the office of the clerk. My chairman have asked me to do this. He has other urgent things. He has to go back home to address his political party situation there. So the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters, over the past time, on the 7th of August, during the sitting of committee meetings, had meeting and had some important things, and I'm going to go through them quickly, as time is not our friend. It is important to highlight some of the activities undertaken by the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters in the area of labor migration and migration management in Africa. Pursuant to the provision of Rule 26, subsection 3 of the Pan-African Parliament Rule of Procedures, the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters has the specific responsibility of introducing issues of immigration for consideration by the chambers and to come up with recommendations on how best to manage the issues of migration on the continent. The role of the Pan-African Parliament on labor migration governance is to promote the ratification and domestication of the AU legal instruments on employment and migration, to advocate for regional integration of labor markets through harmonization of legal framework on labor and social protection, to also advocate for increased fundings and budgetary allocation to employment policies at national levels. According to aspiration 1 of AU Agenda 63, which calls for a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, PAP has the role to promote implementation of the productivity promotion at all levels. Based on these requirements of the Pan-African Parliament Rules of Procedure and the African Union Agenda 2063, the PAP Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters undertook the following activities on labor migration in Africa. Support to the Global Compact on Migration. In its effort to strengthen the continental solidarity, cooperation and development, and build a sense of common destiny, the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters consider all the 6 thematic areas of the Global Compact on Migration. To this end, an item on migration has always featured prominently on the agenda of the committee and later on tabled to the PAP plenary for consideration and adoption of pertinent recommendations. As the continental organization representing the people of Africa, in its effort of managing migration, PAP discussed and adopted recommendations on the African Common Position on the Global Compact on Migration. The Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters resolved to create a Pan-African Parliamentary Forum on Migration, which objectives are, among others, to promote safe migration, a cross-border trade, and the right of refugees, promote the free movement of goods and services, capital, and people across the African continent. The creation of the forum has been adopted by the Pan-African Parliament plenary some years ago, I think like a year ago. The committee collaborated with the International Organization for Migration on management of migration on the African continent. It received briefings from IOM on issues relating to migration, makes pertinent recommendations on which are adopted by the Pan-African Parliament plenary. The Pan-African Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters participated in several continental international meetings on labor migration, such as the first meeting of the AU Labor Migration Committee held in Dakar, Senegal, in May of 2018. The symposium on fostering labor mobility within and from Africa held in Nairobi, Kenya in July 2018. Labor migration has become a very important phenomenon in Africa. Labor migration affects several areas of society, including politics, economics, and culture. The importance of labor migration is also evident in the African Union Agenda. Agenda 2063 states that the eradication of poverty will be achieved inter alia through investing in the productive capacity, skills, and assets of our people. Summary of the report of the Committee on Trade on Labor Migration Governance in Africa. During the Pan-African Parliamentary Committee's second statutory sitting for year 2018 held from 4 to 11 August 2018, a joint presentation was made to the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters and the Committee on Transport, Industry, Communication, Energy, Science and Technology by the International Organization on Migration on labor migration governance on the African continent. The presenter gave the global migration status. He indicated that there are 245 million international migrants across, which represent 3.3% of world's population. Among the international migrants, 150 million are migrant workers. It has been highlighted that in 2015, 72% of all international migrants were aged 20 to 64 years. African migrants residing within the region has grown from 2000 onwards, especially during the last 5 years period. The majority of international migrants in Africa migrated within their regions, 80% of which occurs between countries with a common border. The presentation focused on the following items. 1, fostering labor mobility within and from Africa. 2, the joint program on labor migration governance for development and integration. 3, the African Union framework on labor migration. 4, the regional economic communities, actions in labor migration governance in Africa. The United Nations Global Compact on Migration. It was emphasized that overall objectives of the labor migration governance for development and integration is to strengthen the effective governance and regulation of labor migration and mobility in Africa, under the rules of law, the involvement of key stakeholders, such as the relevant government ministries or departments, labor, employment, interior, education, etc., the private employer workers' organizations, and migrant diaspora. At the end of the presentation, members discussed how Africa could learn from the European Union in terms of integration and opening up borders. Members of the two committees were encouraged to be champions in various interventions at continental, regional, and national levels. A clarification was made on the statistics presented regarding the age group of African migrants, and the committee agreed that most of the African migrants were below the age of 50. The current statistic presented a global picture. The IOM representative informed the members that there were plans of setting up a regional migration data hub in Africa to improve accessibility of data. The members of the two committees made the following recommendations. 1, there is need for more information and interventions on irregular, illegal migrant, and relevant information should be provided to potential migrants to assist them make informed decisions. 2, the International Organization for Migration should conduct further research to ascertain the age range for African migrants. There is need, number 3, there is need for Africa to invest in labor market competitiveness in order to compete on international labor market, noting that there are opportunities abroad. 4, perhaps should learn from Brexit in the European Union, as Africa was considering the agenda of regional and continental integration. Conclusion. After looking at the importance of labor migration in Africa, the Committee on Trade, Customs, and Immigration Matters resolved to bring the matters to the attention of all PAP members. Therefore, the International Organization for Migration has already made the presentation to our plenary, and I hope that you're going to take some important issues from there. So, Mr. President, I want to thank you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. These are the few recommendations the committee have made, and we hope that you will adopt these recommendations and our findings from the meeting. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Merci, cher collègue.
Thank you, dear colleague. We're sorry for the delay in which you had with presenting this report, because it was supposed to be the first item. But I just wanted to say, following upon the second report, that the problem of migration is not going to stop. When we see our populations, you'll find that they are growing and getting younger. And we have a Western population that is aging, and that means that Europe will always need African labor. But I think we need to encourage reflection on human migration. We need to improve the conditions of migration, and instead of our youth having to lose their lives in the Mediterranean. And we need to say that if we need youth workers, the conditions for acquiring visas should be flexible, and the West, which in the beginning used to come to Africa without visas, also needs to make the visa conditions are flexible so that our youth can go and work. And that's the first point. But the ideal for us is industrialization, or even better, economic transformation of our continent that would make it possible for the youth to remain in their countries of origin, because it's a double-edged sword. And you'll find that there are issues from the departure point and the arrival points. And this is what I was saying yesterday during the post-Cotonou negotiations in 2020. The Africans will have questions, which are, when it comes to negotiating an agreement with the ACP countries, instead of negotiating a direct agreement with the EU, it would be better to negotiate with them, because the issues we are facing are to do with the two continents. The problems that are receiving the migrants are complaining, but even we are complaining about the phenomenon of losing our children in the Mediterranean. So we need to look at how we're going to conclude the post-Cotonou agreement, and we need to participate in the negotiations and make suggestions, especially with regards to issues regarding the two continents. We have the issues of migration, terrorism, climate change, and if we reach an agreement between Europe, the EU and ACP countries, we need to ensure that there are special arrangements on certain issues. The general debate is now open. The first person on my list is Honorable Nasien Nyeregugugu from Rwanda. Ignacien, you have the floor.
Je vous remercie.
I would like to thank you, Mr. President of the Pan-African Parliament. I have two questions to ask. One of the questions is to do with migration in general, and the second is to do with one of the components of migration, which is asylum seeking, or refugee status. With regards to the migration policy, I would like to ask whether the IOM has a role to play. What happens is that, for instance, in North Africa, Europe, as was said by Mr. President, Europe needs these people. Africa also needs for these people to have something. Otherwise, we need to find ways of doing this properly. And for instance, you cannot enter into a country that is not yours as if you're just walking into a local market. There are papers everywhere. Of course, you need a passport. But why do you bring people in without papers, or allow people onto the boats without papers? So I'd like to ask whether IOM has a role to play to ensure that people have rights. If they are not registered and don't have papers to go somewhere, then they need to stay where they are. So I'd like to ask IOM, because it's an international issue, and we need to address this upstream and downstream. We cannot continue to see people dying. And you find that there are countries that don't want to receive these people in the boats. So there is this hypocrisy that exists when it comes to the lives of people, and this needs to stop. But I just want to know IOM's role in all this. Secondly, the issue regarding refugees, the situation of refugees has been very serious. People come into camps, but you find that there are camps you find that there are 20 or 30 people who are temporary refugees. But what does that mean? what is UNHCR is doing is good, but at least they need to have the minimum. They need shelter. And you find that their children become refugees, and it goes down the various generations, and they become lost in the camps because the life in camps is not a life. It's just to survive. What does IOM think, and what is the possible solution? Because this affects all countries. And these are the two comments I want to make. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Honorable Tul Siraj Benedin from Mauritius, you have the floor.
President, first of all, I would like to thank the two speakers who have spoken from the IOM and also from the Committee on Trade, Customs and Immigration Matters. I know that this is a very burning issue because when we say, for example, that the world now has become a global village, why can't Africans among themselves show their solidarity? We know that there has been discussions for the free movement of persons, but yet, like has said Honorable Ignatian, I think there are still a lot of complications to obtain permit. Even we know cases where people want to invest. They come for business to invest in countries. It's not easy to get even an occupational permit. And so particularly for the youth who are in quest of employment, I think that we should move fast, we should be more flexible, but of course, the laws of each country must be respected. And in terms of job employment in the countries, I think that first of all, we should also implement the convention, ILO convention, which says that there should be no discrimination, there should be harmonized labor standards, no discrimination in terms of work, and the right to also you can maintain your values, your culture, your identity with the country of origin. There are many things, many conditions that are necessary. I think that we should work. First of all, we should see what are the standards of the IOM to be respected, and also the standards of the International Labour Organization, because we migrate to a country for job employment, for job opportunities, because if we find that we cannot get a job, the young people have the qualifications, but they cannot find a decent job in their own country. They want to go elsewhere. So I think that there should be solidarity among the African countries. When we say that there should be free movement, I think that this protocol from the African Union should be taken as a matter of priority. So the appeal that I make here is that we should respect the conventions, international conventions. There should be more harmonization in terms of labor laws and employment policies in our respective countries. On this note, I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je donne...
Thank you indeed. The floor now is to Honorable Kone Abubakar Sidiki from Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you, Mr. President. I would wish to add my voice to thank the presenters, as did the previous speakers, and agree with you that the issue of migration is of paramount importance. And I stand corrected by my colleagues as I share the experience of my country, Cote d'Ivoire, which is an extremely open country with 26% of migrants out of a population of 25 million. Mr. President, as long as countries are not afflicted by dire economic crises, nationalism will not crop up recurrently, so to speak. Cote d'Ivoire is an open country, but you note that since the economic crisis and the recession that struck in the 90s, the feeling of nationalism is growing, and rejecting other non-nationals becomes the norm. And the issue of rural land tenure is quite sensitive in Cote d'Ivoire, and I see that in other countries, like Cote d'Ivoire, in the face of crisis, without employment, nationals, indulge in activities that they did not indulge in before, such as agriculture and the tertiary sector. Hence, nationalism now, takes refuge in land ownership. And in my view, this is an area that must be given consideration at the Pan-African level. Secondly, political issues. And you did say rightly, Mr. President, that migration occurred before independence, and rightly or wrongly, some persons feel that the descendants of these migrants are sort of sheep, election sheep for one or the other party, and therefore there is an increasing resentment of such persons by nationalities, because after the concept of Ivorian, there is a new development, and I think you have seen that on social media. Ivorians first. That is a new slogan. And 2 years before the presidential election in Cote d'Ivoire, I believe that in conjunction with the IOM to start raising awareness at Cote d'Ivoire, I am also a Secretary General of a parliamentary network, because I believe that this awareness is important, because communication around this slogan of Ivorians first might actually spill over before the 2020 election. Now, regarding migration between Africa and Europe, as the OIM, what are the mechanisms that you have developed that facilitate migration? I understood from your presentation that migration should be by choice and not out of need. I agree with you. However, even where there is a need, the destination is a choice. And even in that case, that choice has to be respected. I think that we should not fudge this matter by, restricting immigration between African countries or intra-African migration. We have to look at this globally, and all global places have the same value. Whether you're moving from Cote d'Ivoire to Kigali, is the same movement from Mali to Belgium. So we must not attempt to contain migration in Africa. And that is what I find in your approach, to the effect that as long as you can move within Africa, there is no problem. We need to protect Europe, and we have to, keep off lots of migrants to Europe. I think we have to be honest and candid in our approach. We have to be honest in our policy. The world is a global village. We must not try to contain things in a geographical area. We should be open and should be bold enough to open, our doors to those who want to go to study or work. Thank you, Honorable Member. The floor is to Honorable Said from the Sahrawi Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to extend my thanks to the presenters for the quality of the presentations on this very serious phenomenon which Africa is suffering from at the moment. African countries are the most affected by migration at the international level. There are clear causes for this phenomenon. There are economic causes, social, political, religious causes, and many other causes. In Africa, the causes are basically economic. This is due to poverty, weak economic policies, and the lack of paying attention to the future of our young people. Among migrants, we find university graduates. We also find the unemployed. And we also find illiterate migrants. There are various problems here, problems that are due to the dangers faced by migrants. Migrants die in the process, and some of them are killed on the way of migration. There are also the difficult conditions in the host countries as well as in the transit countries. We need to take into account all these issues to be able to identify the right solutions to this very serious phenomenon in our continent. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you indeed. I'll now give the floor to Honorable Sekou Fanta Madis Traoré from Mali. Mr. President, distinguished members, the issue under discussion today is of utmost importance. It is of paramount importance to the effect that we are talking about humans here. Migration is an age-old phenomenon. In my country, it has spanned thousands of years, and I'm referring here to Mali, and to move across the 4 cardinal points of the earth. In Oceania, specifically in Albania, there is a Diawara family that has settled there for over 400 years. And there are several other such examples. And this migration has, or in fact it's not new, but has been there, or rather, men in their animal instincts all the way from independence, because I'm not referring to colonization, because the colonial masters who came here had no visas, had nothing, and therefore sort of invaded the continent and tapped and continued to exploit our resources, all of our mineral resources, including commodities like cocoa and coffee. And all of these were shipped by major European companies from the African continent with extensive and cheap labor. So there came a time, the time of independence, the African continent generally, there was migration then. And Honorable Kone discussed this. And if you hear Kone, it is from Mali. Or it could also be from Guinea. It is also found in Senegal, as well as in Burkina Faso. So, and so much more, as the president said. It's even Ivorian, obviously. So when you look at all of these sociological phenomena, you would agree that today it is misgovernance that drives migration, and it is the fundamental reason of this scourge, of this phenomenon where we reject, we resent the other ones. He said it, the PDCI, RDA under Felix Houphouët-Boigny was an open country. Where, you know, salt from Mali went to Côte d'Ivoire, and there was trade between the two countries, back and forth, without any hitches. But with this cyclic crisis, everyone has tried to build a sort of no man's land and to sort of grab, or, you know, sort of grab what they have from their country. And as Honorable Kagame said, we should not work in isolation, but working together would help us to drive socio-economic development without any customs barriers or any other boundaries between our states. That would ease free movement of goods and persons. And this will be achieved and would generate or would add value to our own produce, such that Europe would not buy our produce at low cost, and they would rather trade with us on equal terms, and they would actually want to encourage migration. And that is the existence we need between Africans. And if we do not do that, then welcome to mayhem. Thank you. Thank you, distinguished member, for this chronicle. I referred a while ago to the Malian Empire, or the Miro Naba, that helped peaceful migration across several countries of West Africa. I would now give the floor to Honorable Abi Dakim Mualim Ahmed Malin from Somalia.
Abdi Hakim Mualim from Somalia. You have the floor.
Mr. President, I would like to thank the presenters. I believe that migration is due to a number of causes. And without dealing with the root causes, we won't be able to stop illegal migration. Among these causes, we have unemployment, poverty, repression, lack of security, and terrorism. In addition to the lack of opportunity. Obviously, all these causes have created a lack of equal opportunities for citizens. These causes have created the migration conditions we are facing at the moment. African leaders and governments have a role to play in addressing these conditions. They have to deal with political situations and conflicts, and also they have to deal with the policies that led to this migration. And all of this means that university graduates now cannot find jobs. This is generating a great deal of pressure and sadness among young people due to these terrible living conditions. We can overcome such terrible conditions, but we need to understand that the root cause is the repressive nature of policies. I believe that countries and the African Union can play a role in this regard. I think that yesterday we had a debate on this. And we were talking about elections and electoral observations. And we had reports that observation was done in a correct manner. But we know that elections are not taking place in a transparent manner. And it is not possible for people with ambitions to live under dictatorship and oppression. Therefore, we have to talk about the root causes before we address issues like unemployment and poverty. We need to understand the root causes and the people who are behind such situations. For this reason, I believe that it is important that we should try as much as possible to deal with these root causes. And one way of solving the problem is to have transparent elections. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Honorable Member. I'll now give the floor to Honorable Sulima Ahmed El Kaid from the Sahara Republic.
Honorable Sulema.
Honorable Sulma is not around. I'll now give the floor to the Honorable Charles Majak Alia Deni, South Sudan.
Thank you, Mr. President. This issue of labor migration, which is put in form of governance, is a serious issue whose solution lies with African governments or Africa as people. And this is based